Never had a handshake.
Wow, what a result.
I think he's just so demoralized because he's losing to such an idiot like me, you know? It's just, it must be embarrassing for the world champion to lose to me.
Magnus Carlsen is now the 5-time world chess champion.
27, and it's the match. Look at him, look at him. Oh, he won a rook a5. No! No, this did not just happen.
My vengeance will be victory on the chessboard.
Magnus Carlsen, the undisputed king.
I'll probably win without too many issues.
All right, guys, we are here for the match of the day, the one that everyone has been waiting for. How's the crowd feeling about today's match here? Let's go. Let's hear some energy from the crowd. It's time. It's time. Wow. Yeah. Yeah, okay. First player, our first player of today's match, Grandmaster Magnus Carlsen. Let me know, Hala, let me know. Okay, okay. And his opponent, Grandmaster Hans Niemann. Now. All right, guys, we need you guys to get hyped one more time. We got to hear that energy in the audience. Where is it? Where's the energy from the audience? There it is. Guys, matches are about to start. Let's send it back to you.
The crowd is going crazy. Not sure what's going on there with Hans just a second ago. If something, he left something or needed something, but there he goes. He's got it all figured out. Both players are settled in. Too bad there's no seatbelts in those chairs because they're going to need to buckle up. That energy in that room was real. Robert, we can feel it up here.
Oh, we definitely can, and everyone has their thoughts on these two. It's the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. It's the upstart. It's the player who some believe is the martyr, who was done wrong. But as I watched in the Liam Neeson movie, there are no winners in the land of saints and sinners. And for these two, I mean, there's a lot of history. There's a lot on the line emotionally. And I think especially for Hans Niemann, you see him there. He's locked in, and he wants this one more than anything in the world.
He's locked in. He's loaded. You see he came out. He's serious. He has, for lack of a better way to put it, obviously embraced the opportunity here. He speaks his mind loud and clear and made comments coming in that if Magnus Carlsen lost this match, he wouldn't be able to show his face anymore. I'm not sure how Magnus would feel about that, but I know that nothing else could be said in regards to what both these players want to happen in this match.
And Magnus, even if he does lose, will have to show his face tomorrow because there is the consolation match. And you see Hans, he's got his headphones around his neck. Magnus seems headphoneless at the moment. So what do you think the deal is there?
They're trying to get the sound dialed in. Players brought their own headphones, which they are allowed in-ear as long as wired. Apparently, the issue is that Hans is actually not getting sound from his headphones, I believe, that he's not hearing the music or the playlist. Again, everything the players bring is fully reviewed, thoroughly checked, and approved by multiple sources and multiple different types of security. So whatever's going on here, he's just trying to get dialed in and comfy and make sure that he's got his mind right before taking on the GOAT. And I don't even know that Magnus is is even aware where his headphones are right now.
Which means he might be hearing us, which is bad news for the players. But hopefully for Magnus and the crew, they get everything ready, set, and take off. Because, Danny, that's what everyone has been waiting for, is this matchup between these two, the first time that they're sitting across from each other in 2 years.
We're getting the players set. I can confirm these are the two voices they definitely cannot hear. They cannot hear us down there, so no one needs to worry about it. As the players get set, our arbiter gets them dialed in. Our last thoughts before the first moves are made here. Hans Niemann, the underdog, maybe in his mind he's not. Magnus Carlsen tweeted something this morning that maybe people saw. Lance Stevenson, obviously a reference to maybe he's LeBron James in that relationship. Either way, the banter, the drama, like it's enough already, right? Let the chess speak, as they now say.
Well, we will see the chess any minute now, and I cannot wait. The players, there's so much at stake here, right? Each and every move, it's not just a typical chess game. There are those platitudes, those cliches. The players, they just have to ignore everything else. But how can you with their history? I mean, we'll do our best to cover it, every single move. But for these players, will they be objective? That's a real question.
And I think that's maybe what Hans is hoping for, right? And that's a lot of the things that he talks about, the things that he's said in the past. I think he's trying to play, meta 5D chess here while everyone else is playing checkers chess or whatever that is. We know that it's been a couple of years of it. And while we get the players settled in and take care of whatever the final issues are going on before the players are comfortable, we'll throw to yet another trip down memory lane here and what's happened since Magnus Carlsen first beat, since Hans Niemann first beat Magnus Carlsen at the FTX Crypto Cup.
Chess speaks for itself.
Is it something special doing this against Magnus, Hans?
For the first time in 2 years since the chess world was set ablaze with drama, Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann will face each other in person live at the 2024 Speedchess Championship in Paris.
I think everybody should get their popcorn ready.
The last time they played, the upstart Niemann defeated the chess GOAT Carlsen in an impressive endgame.
Wow, what a result. What a result.
Carlsen then threw gasoline on the media firestorm by withdrawing from the tournament and issuing a cryptic but seemingly accusatory tweet. In the aftermath, Niemann's history of online cheating emerged. Multiple statements and interviews from Niemann, Carlsen, and Chess.com generated a controversial he said, they said debate combined with salacious speculation and major media coverage.
All I did was win a chess game.
The matter came to a head when Niemann sued Carlsen. His company, Play Magnus Group, Chess.com, Danny Wrench, and Hikaru Nakamura in federal court for an astonishing $500 million. After multiple filings, the lawsuit was ultimately dismissed from federal court, and the parties ended their legal dispute. Ever since, the world has been waiting for a new battle between Niemann and Carlsen. But Carlsen has avoided the youngster who is now rapidly climbing the chess charts and defeating super grandmasters. Now things come to a head in Paris as the two cannot evade each other any longer.
It will be Hans versus Magnus in Paris.
Carlsen is confident, but Niemann is hell-bent on vindication.
My vengeance will be victory on the chessboard.
Who will triumph in this incredible showdown?
We'll probably win without too many issues.
All eyes are on Paris.
All eyes are on Paris. All eyes on those players. Still getting dialed in. Maybe getting a little bit closer. Before they sat down and started getting dialed in, Robert, you and I were over here spotting a certain Magnus Carlsen getting some last-minute reps before the match started. You want to tell everybody what you saw?
He was playing some bullet. He was just trying to get used to the mouse, trying to get used to the setup, and he, I think, went 1.5 out of 3 in those games. But that bullet comes later, Danny. They start in the longest time control, and you would have to imagine that favors the higher-rated player, in this case, Magnus Carlsen.
And Magnus is the favorite objectively, regardless of the optics of making that statement and all that's been discussed and the drama off the board here as far as bias of different kinds. But anyone who's followed these guys' careers, and that's not really any disrespect to Hans Niemann. He's 21 years old. He's had an incredible rise over the last couple of years. There's plenty of chess ahead in his career. And going up against Magnus Carlsen, he should be the underdog. Frankly, everyone's an underdog, unless you're a computer these days. Everyone is an underdog against Magnus Carlsen. And what does he do to get himself in a mindset where he doesn't feel that way?
Well, think about where Hans has been recently. He goes to the Netherlands. He's supposed to be the underdog against Anish Giri. He takes him down. Then he plays 2 more matches against Nikita Vitiugov and Etienne Bacrot here in Paris. He beats them both, in fact, quite handily, in fact. So you see Hans Niemann on the rise. His rating has allowed him to climb up to number 16 in the world. And we know his opponent's number 1 in the world. So that is the biggest obstacle. But Hans, his self-belief, that could be his downfall, but also could be his best blessing.
Confidence, right? We just talked to an Ali Reza Firouzja who might be more confident than he ever has been in his career. And chess is a mental game, right? When you're confident, what you're capable of matters. And Hans has been riding high, feeling confident, and looks a little more dialed in and ready. He seems to have gotten his tech issues figured out, while Magnus Carlsen is dialing in the same. All the players were on site yesterday, checking it all out. So who knows what's going on? Last-minute nerves, last-minute issues of some kind. We have no idea. We're just going to continue to talk and hype a match that, frankly, needs almost no more introduction, right?
No words are needed.
No words are needed. So we're kind of, I mean, Robert and I have been waiting for this moment for all day. And so we're like, get some chess on the board. But okay, as Magnus figures it out, let's take a trip into the chess here a little bit. And let me ask you, one of the things you and I often get into once we start seeing the moves made on the board is who's going to drive the roads toward opening theory, or who has the interest in avoiding some of the main lines and getting into that dark, murky woods that can be a complicated middle game as soon as possible, right? So from a match strategy point of view, as you put yourself in the head of both of these players, your thoughts on, maybe start with Hans, what Hans might want to accomplish in the first stage of the game in regards to opening prep.
Well, if we take it back to 2022, what he said, he understood that Magnus might play some offbeat lines, as Magnus is known to do, and he caught him. So if we see something like that, where Magnus is trying to avoid theory, but playing perhaps not the openings with the most teeth, they lack bite, they're just kind of wavering around, then perhaps Hans feels like his confidence, his stride, will take him the rest of the way.
At the same time, I mean, this is something Magnus does against everyone, right? Like, obviously, Hans caught him as black in that very now infamous game, right? And in that obscure kind of Catalan. But Magnus specializes in making people feel uncomfortable, right? And one game probably doesn't change his strategy if he does feel like against his opponent, he'd rather get roads less traveled.
It's true. I mean, Magnus is the king of just getting any position and winning them no matter what the evaluation is. It could say it's dead equal, there's no life here, and yet Magnus is able to squeeze the life out of his opponent, just make them suffer, make them struggle move after move. But if there's somebody who feels like they've struggled and suffered more than anyone, it's Hans. And he's spoken quite loudly about it. He's been in that interview room with Levy. He told the world that he feels like this will be his day. And when you're playing someone who is objectively the stronger player, maybe that confidence, overconfidence in fact, can help you out. You just go for him. Because if you allow Magnus to play his game, you're the underdog. What are you supposed to do about that?
Well said, and he is the underdog. He is the underdog. Let's talk about the Titan that he has to face again. Magnus Carlsen is the reigning SCC champion. He's won 3 of the last 5 SCC events, only lost to Hikaru Nakamura and the Frenchman with 3 names. Too bad Maxime isn't here this week, and shout out to you, Maxime, at home. I know you're listening. And he's the best of the best of the best in all 3 time controls, Robert. It's that simple.
There's no surprises there. There's no looking at the X's and O's. He just has everyone's number, except for those 2 names. And Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, we know how powerful he is. Let's give it up for Maxime in the house, because we have so many French fans here.
Yeah.
They're clapping for Maxime, their hometown hero. But Hans Niemann also took down Maxime. So there is a little bit of commonality there. And for Hans, he wants to channel that success and keep it going. He's won, what, 5 matches in a row now. As I mentioned, the 3 over the board, and those 2 in the SEC to get here.
2024 has been a good year for Hans Niemann so far. He'd like that to continue. We're being told that Magnus just gave a thumbs up to our staff on the monitor we have here, and we should be getting underway here in just seconds, everybody. So don't worry, the last second delay in drama was not scripted in any way, any more than anything else people say are scripted these days in the chess world. We've got drama, we've got action, and we are going to have chess in less than 10 seconds. I don't know if you want to count down with me, Robert, but I got nothing else to say. Let the moves happen. Let's get this show underway. Can I get an amen?
I think the crowd can give that to you. I'm not going to give you a countdown. I'm from New York. Can't stand that on New Year's. But what I can't stand is this match. I cannot wait for this first move to be played and for the match to get underway, because we see their blitz ratings, Magnus Carlsen, at least the heavy favorite heading into the match.
And just like that, we're off. Magnus Carlsen has played 1b3 as the crowd cheers up here against Hans Niemann. Maybe Hikaru Nakamura playbook, we're going to see a full ready commencing on the board here with Hans taking the early light squared bishop approach. Solid stuff right now from both sides. Are you surprised to see a double fianchetto approach now from Magnus?
Well, I don't know if Audubon is working with Magnus, but we know the B3 Cowboy has made chessable courses and has been perhaps the most vocal proponent of this B3 move on move one. So we see both bishops fianchettoed for white. So instead of striking at the center with pawns, these bishops would like to do the heavy lifting. At some point, you will have to strike in the center. But Danny, as we look at the board, we look at the clock, it's Magnus playing a little bit more quickly. So Hans is just trying to figure out how to play the most accurate response after each and every turn.
Yeah, he's taking his time, doesn't want to be thrown off perhaps by an opening he didn't prepare for. Is that an early sign that Magnus has surprised him and that he chose something that Hans wasn't ready for with this 1b3 approach? It is obscure. Wouldn't be surprised if he's like, all right, let me take a second to make sure I don't get a bad middle game. The eval bar, as you can see, is 50-50 there, meaning this is a roughly equal position, a coin flip. Often what matters in these games is who gets the middle game they're comfortable with. Forget the evaluation. Who knows the plans? Who's more familiar with the tactics and the patterns? That's going to decide the game, and Magnus plays c4, our first aggressive pawn move in the center by white.
Yes, c4 to put pressure on d5, hoping that black moves that pawn to make that fianchetto feel extra strong. But both players should have familiarity with b3 lines because Hikaru Nakamura, he just lost his match to Alireza Firouzja, but he's been so successful with that first move throughout his chess career. And Danny, knight c6, development by Hans. All 4 minor pieces are out for each side. We've had no trades thus far, so the position remains closed. And typically we would think that's Magnus's specialty. He loves playing these maneuvering games, but Hans seems unfazed.
These guys have brought the tension in their relationship to the board. The tension is building. They refuse to give way. No one wants to blink. Not a single piece has been traded, as you said. It's not very common you get a position like this. And on that note, the tension is finally broken. You can cut it with a knife. C takes d5. Maybe getting a rook to the c file quickly is Magnus's plan, right? You've got a knight on c6 in front of the c pawn, and indeed he does it. There's also a quick plan to highlight, either via rook c2 or the queen moving up. Sometimes white will try to go for a battery on the long diagonal in these positions. You guard the e pawn, the queen comes to a1. There's tactics on the diagonal and pressure on the knight on c6. Little funky.
Definitely funky. And for black, you often want to put a rook on c8, but not so easy because this bishop can jump out to a new diagonal and hit that rook when it lands there. But Danny, you called it. Rook c2, queen a1 potentially in the near future.
It could be a bad sign for Magnus that I just called the entire plan, rook c1, rook c2. That's probably not the level of chess he's looking for today, Danny Rich style. But it is a common plan in the structure, jokes aside. The queen battery will be dangerous. And the fun thing about it next is that if that e2 pawn isn't targeted, Robert, the e rook can also come to c1. And so you have this almost like Sicilian-style structure for white, right, with the open c-file. And in fact, the knight gets out of the way so that black can avoid this battery that's coming and maybe play pawn to c6 or c5.
That's a really strong move. Retreating moves with the knight are especially difficult to find. Hans backs up to go forward to d7 next to reinforce this knight on f6. And then the queen will get active after that because it's no longer tending to that knight on the king side. So I really like the way that Hans has played thus far. And I think he should be building confidence because he's handled the opening stage of this first game very well.
Seems to be confident. Lean back in his chair a little bit. Giving Magnus something to think about here as Magnus uses a little bit of the extra time he had to decide where to go. Does he follow through with the battery plan, the queen coming to a1? Does he look to do something different now that Hans has relocated this knight, as you said, a very strong idea?
Preempted it. And for Hans, he's now catching up on the clock as Magnus continues to think, trying to come up with perhaps a new plan. But queen a1 was the idea. It just doesn't have great effect anymore. And for Magnus, I'm actually not really seeing it. He is very passive in his position. All of his pieces on his own first 3 ranks. That's typically not what we recommend in chess. And he's trying to let his pieces lead the way, but we do typically like having our pawns, because this pawn on d5, for example, I'll change the color to blue, it restricts the bishop on g2's axis. Instead, Danny, we see queen c1 inviting c6.
Queen c1 invites c6, and it's awkward because you wonder where's the queen going next. So what does Magnus have up his sleeve? The problem when you have less space, Robert, just to highlight, is white has every single piece that they started with, besides the pawn you traded, which means they're kind of wrestling each other for squares, right? You see the cramped position of the queen, the rook, the knight, the bishop. They're all in each other's way. And black actually has more space, especially if you do get at some point to play c5 or even c6, and you can start advancing because you have the furthest center pawn on d5.
That's right, and c5 comes with an added threat, I'll put that in air quotes, of a4, just trying to chisel at white's pawn structure and create some isolated pawns. So I think that Hans has done everything right, and now he's spending time, because Danny, there are some positions where you get tempted to lash out, and he has just done that. But rook takes c5 is not out of the question. I know you typically don't want to give up a rook for just a bishop and a pawn, but if you can control all the dark squares, that could be to white's benefit, and here goes Magnus.
Magnus sacrifices the exchange, and it cannot be underestimated how big this moment is here. One, is Magnus playing that because he felt this game getting away? And if this game gets away, you couldn't have scripted it better for Hans Niemann. Winning with black to start the match, we said the only real chance Hans Niemann has in this match is to take an early lead, put Magnus on his heels emotionally, mentally. So I know we're early, and I know that there's going to be plenty of drama and hype here. We don't need to add to it with the hyperbole, but this is a big game. Hans wins this game up the exchange, and who knows what we're in for.
Objectively, the exchange sacrifice was justified. Here, we see the bishop h3 move, but it probably came at the wrong moment. Rook b6 hits the queen. There's a pawn that was behind that queen, and this queen on a4 is dangerously close to getting trapped. It has to reroute to the center, queen to d4. But excuse me, is this pawn on b3? Can you just capture that one?
I think it's hanging. Now, Magnus will have the queen and bishop on the dark square battery for the rest of the game, and that is good old-fashioned family fun on the king side, so black has to worry about that. But again, it's an exchange and a pawn, and Magnus is in trouble here.
He is, because it's actually just an exchange. That pawn on b3 was won by Hans, so it's not enough material compensation for Magnus, not even close. And he does have that great queen and bishop lined up. Knight d2 kicks that rook back. That rook on b5, honestly, is a bit awkwardly placed. But if black gets queen b6, suddenly we see the queens leave the board, and that has to be to Hans' benefit.
Yeah, queen to b6 looks great. Magnus allows the queen trade. This is going to be super tough to hold. And Magnus doesn't even have a time advantage to go with it. Hans has plenty of time on the clock. This already looks like a game that could, if anybody around the world wasn't tuning into this match at this point, if Hans Niemann wins with black to set things in motion here in Paris on our second semifinal match of this Friday, call everybody. Call your aunt, even the one who never answers, and you don't even know if she knows how to use the internet.
Well,
this is going to break it.
This bishop on d4 is about to just be the hero in white's position. Look at it cover the b2 square. It can't be attacked very easily. A knight's about to hop out to e3. Maybe we'll see the bishop give itself up for this knight and try to win that central pawn. And rooks need open files. The c file is open, but unfortunately it's unattainable. The bishop on h3 covers that square. Rook e8 does all of nothing because the knight wants to get on e3 anyway. And Danny, that was a terrible move. The rook is trapped.
Rook is trapped. Knight to d2, and the rook has no squares. Oh my gosh, and Hans Niemann takes a brilliantly played game as black here, potentially starting off in a way that you couldn't ask for better, and just absolutely blunders with the rook on b3.
And now it's simple. You take this rook. In fact, you don't have to right yet because that rook can't go anywhere. But even if you take back, I thought the rook can slide to c1. There are all sorts of back rank checkmates against this king because the bishop's on h7. So, Danny, I hear some fire trucks or an ambulance, but I don't think they're for Hans.
Well, you had the display poster downstairs a little bit ago. This is fine. No, this is not fine anymore. Hans Niemann was in a great spot. This is no longer fine. The chessboard, the proverbial room is on fire here, and f3 is a Magnus move. Just recognizing that rook has no squares, get my king a path to enter the endgame as soon as I need to. This is looking tough. What a turnaround that move was with b5.
Tragic. You're trying to advance what could be a passed pawn. Instead, you are limiting the retreat squares from your rook. And now that rook has been captured, this bishop can even slide back to b2. Instead, he goes rook to b1, giving up a3. Yeah, he can, at any moment, play a move like bishop c5.
He wants bishop c5. Yeah, the pawns are going nowhere. And look at that bishop on h7. It's not playing. That diagonal is like looking at a brick wall on d3. I'm trying to find the way. We talk about how is the position blunderable, and I'm not seeing the way that Magnus can blunder this position. There are no tactics. There are really no weaknesses. And with Hans' clock ticking down, I think that the storyline we thought we were going to get with Hans winning as black is not going to be the case.
Yeah, the advantage was never that big, to be clear. And he did have an extra exchange. It was a sacrifice. But perhaps he can fight his way back in this one. Rook c1 hits that knight. Oh, there's this back rank checkmate problem. So I don't even know where you go here.
It's not even that the bishop isn't good, it's that the king is getting checkmated.
Oh.
He is threatening bishop takes d3. What a fun move, a creative resourceful trick by Hans Niemann, because if you take c7, bishop takes d3, you not only free the mate, but you might queen the b pawn. Okay, Magnus sees it, of course, and now he's headed in. Bishop c5 check will be all she wrote. There will be checkmate on e8 or not, because Hans Niemann resigns. And Magnus Carlsen strikes first, despite what was objectively a great start to the match. A good. Yes, his advantage wasn't huge for Hans, but Hans was in a good spot as black there.
Yeah, Magnus missed something. He allowed that rook swing to b6 to win a pawn on b3. But you could tell Magnus, he chose violence. He chose to give up an exchange, and he went for a line that was very tricky. And here, on the other hand, we have a very calm start to game 2. Hans has the white pieces. He's rerouting his pieces to the king side. This knight often hops up to g3. But Danny, we said Hans needs to get in the lead early. He's now down by 1 point, and he has to be objective. He can't start thinking about the results.
It's still early, right? He does need to get a lead early, I think, from our perspective, when we think about the match strategy and the psychology of both of these players. But you're right. Obviously, losing one game, you don't want the wheels to come off quickly against the GOAT. For the record, was that the first complete game these guys have played since September 4th, 2022? I think we should all take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that, a moment of silence for the fact that we have a complete chess game between Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann. In this case, it was the former world champion getting the dub.
He did indeed, and now with the black pieces, he's extra solid. No weaknesses, no pawn trades, just a pair of bishops off the board. And Danny, as we look at Magnus, taking a drink here, do you feel like he can relax a little bit? That first game is over, as you just said, and now he can just focus on the moves on the board.
It makes you wonder, right? I mean, look, it's undeniable. Athletes talk about it all the time. You play mind tricks on yourself. You try to get yourself in the best space before kickoff of the Super Bowl, but you're really happy once that first drive is over. They all talk about it, right? So the fact that the first game is over, I think both players might be feeling a little bit better. Hans is obviously not happy that that game didn't go his way. But, yeah, I think Magnus Carlsen, to answer your question, for sure has got to be breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief.
They're both locked in, staring at their computers. We saw the bishops stare at one another and then leave the board. So that's all we've seen happen is both bishops, they're gone. Now the knights will try to find some good homes in enemy territory. This knight can hop out to f5. That could actually be very dangerous with a rook sitting on e3. That rook can swing on over to hurt the black king. But that's why Magnus, sensing that there may be an impending attack on the king side, you're taught to strike in the center.
Strikes in the center to change the structure. You don't want to allow white a chance to just focus with no counterplay. I like the move rook d1, though, from Hans, especially because it was played quickly. I like that. That's a sign psychology, that mentally, that Hans, confident in this second game, not beating himself up. And I think that that is a very important thing that we should take note of early on, right? He's now up a minute on the clock as black and in a good position. I think that if you're in Hans's corner, this shows that he's currently not suffering from any hangovers of game 1.
Yeah, with the white pieces here, the D file opens up. You can double in the right moment. Instead, Magnus is the one challenging for that file. And this knight coming to f5, it will be a problem at some point, but not right now because there's a problem on d1. There's already direct threats in the position. So we see the rook backtrack. Danny, I have to say, Hans is playing a nice game too. And as you said, he has a nice lead on the clock.
He's playing a nice game too, a very disciplined approach too. He tried to go for the kingside attack. Magnus opened the center. He correctly switches gears, will be the first one to grab the only open file. And if he does control the D file, okay, interesting. I was just going to say, Magnus chooses not even to fight for the file and instead go for something a little more dynamic, but at the risk of a D6 pawn that is very weak.
It sort of has some Sicilian vibes, where this pawn is backwards, it can be attacked, but there aren't that many pieces remaining. So look at Magnus, he decides to strike, b5 takes away the c4 square. That knight was trying to venture forward and attack that d6 weakness. So I think that both sides can be happy about some elements of the position here. The d6 pawn a weakness, that's for sure, but black actually has some active play himself. A knight coming to a5 and into c4, that could be annoying.
It's funny, you highlighted Sicilian structure, but there's two bishops missing, right? No dragon bishop on the dark squares despite the fianchetto structure, which can sometimes help to guard the d6 pawn, and no light squared bishop on e6, right, which happens in these Najdorf structures for black. So again, I like the dynamic choice from Magnus. I think it surprised everybody, but I still feel like Hans, especially with the time advantage, in a decent spot here as white, should keep the pressure, look for ideas of queen a3 as well, Magnus takes a passive approach rather than knight a5. What are your thoughts on that?
He's saving himself by covering the f5 square. There was rook takes d6 in the air, and if the queen took back, then knight f5 would be a check and a fork, picking up that queen. But that's what the knight on e7 is doing here. Put that in blue because it's a hero. It's covering that square a second time, and that means there are no funny business on f5.
I mean, I would pretend that I saw that tactic and set you up for it, like an assist for a dunk, but I didn't even see that. So very nice. Rook takes d6 with knight f5 check. No longer possible. Rook b6 defends both pawns.
Just a good move, right? Just trying to bring more pieces into the defense. And it might not just be defense. Later in the game, if Magnus strikes with b4, he can open up lines for his remaining pieces. So both sides have difficult decisions here. Seems like White's pieces are pretty optimally placed, but that's frustrating in chess. All your pieces on good squares. Your knight on e3 wants to hop forward but has nowhere to go. And so he makes a quiet move, king h2. Danny, what are the ideas here?
King h2 is a high-class waiting move. I like those kind of moves in these positions. You don't want to make high-class waiting moves with your pawns, everybody, because those things don't go backwards. And, okay, f3 is a good move, reinforces e4, but in general, one of the tricky parts of these equal-ish positions is you might make a pawn move that you think is harmless, Robert, and that comes back to bite you in the endgame. We see Magnus take advantage of those types of little weaknesses, squeeze water out of the stone so often. So I love that Hans is playing patiently. That's what I like about King h2. And again, f3 reinforces. I'm going to just go on a limb and say I don't think a draw is a bad result for Hans in this game. Objectively, he lost game one. He doesn't want it to get away from him. You don't want to lose 2 in a row ever, but certainly not against the GOAT. And so I think if Hans stays patient with King h2, these moves, I like how he's playing this because a draw is okay. But Magnus says, no, I'm not going to let you stay patient. Here we go.
Oh, we have fireworks now. If you take this pawn on d5, it is a pawn sacrifice, but e4 check at the right moment, but not yet. If we can analyze, if we can take a step back ever so quickly, if you got too quick, if you got greedy with the check, White can actually block your check with an attack against the queen, a fork, and then Black is in huge trouble. So if we go back to the game, he did not rush. He instead blocked that d6 square with his rook, going after d5. And Danny, this is one of those positions where it can get chaotic real fast. c4 is played. If Black takes it, then Knight takes c4. This queen is overloaded, covering c4 and this rook on d6.
c4 tends to be explosive, and Magnus does not want the dynamite to go boom right there. But I want to point out something. This d5 pawn sack was played after Hans played f3. Look at the dark squares on the king side and highlight them for a second, because this is a move you play in blitz and in rapid when you recognize that there's going to be some long-term practical problems here. Regardless of the evaluation, White is going to get in trouble in this game at some point on the king side. Mark our words. And that's why Magnus played d5. He's going for this sort of practical approach to the game to try to get Hans to blunder in the time scramble.
And if you gave Black a dark square bishop, the game is over. Like, White's king is just being hunted. And we see e4 played, not with check, but discover check coming next if he didn't clog that diagonal. So f4 played. That's a loose pawn here. So, Danny, you can't reinforce it with another, and it seems like we have a mistake.
It's a loose pawn, and right as you highlighted it, Hans says, I'm not worried about it. I'm going to let it be, but computer didn't like it. I don't know what the move is. Magnus plays knight f5, a solidifying move. Just show real quick, or highlight, if you take, the pawn takes, and then that e-pawn is protected. So that's a problem. And the knight is loose on e3. The tactics on the king side are going to come back to haunt Hans here.
And another thing, the knight protects the rook. So that knight takes c4 idea we were talking about no longer works. So he gets rid of the knight on f5. The g file is open. Don't be surprised if this knight moves out the way and a rook slides to g6 and there are problems facing that white king. I think this has turned around in a hurry. The evaluation bar clearly in Black's favor, but even if I didn't see that, I just think that White's king is in some trouble and Black's king is safe and sound, and Black's not even down any material.
Couldn't agree more. I feel bad, a commentator's curse here, because right as I was applauding Hans' patience, king h2, and said, don't push pawns, they're the things you can't go back. He played f3 and now f4. You see what happens in these positions. These pawns wish they could just go back to f2 and put the king on g1. Those are the kind of moves you want to avoid in a seemingly equal position. Magnus is just like a tiger. He just waits to pounce on those moments. And the moment the pawn structure changed on the king side, Magnus changed the structure in the center.
And look at this, queen b6. That queen may land on f2. Knight to h5, rook to g6. This looks like a problem for Hans. None of these moves are going to be easy. And let's not forget there's a passed pawn just sitting here on e4 that you also have to look out for, because if you think you're just going to trade and it's going to be equal because we have the same material, not so fast. That pawn could be dangerous. And this pawn on d5, you need to use all of your resources to defend it. Your knight and rook are tethered to that pawn.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I'm sitting here thinking of where are the tricks for White. How does Hans overwhelm the queen, perhaps? Because you got to do it while she still has to guard the rook, and you have that d5 pass pawn. Okay, knight a4 is a way to at least attack the queen, whether she's overwhelmed or not. I like that move, but again, objectively, computer says black should be better. The thing I actually dislike the most about Hans' position right now is that he lost his time advantage. The time scramble is coming, and his king is going to be weak in the end.
Yes, his king is the one that's going to be in trouble. We see a repetition of moves, but there's no way Magnus is going to make a draw. Queen b6 played. I think knight a4 will be met by queen to d8, just adding another attacker on this d5 pawn. And also, knight h5 is not out of the question in the near future. So Magnus, he's making Hans believe that there may be a draw on the table, but I do not think he's going to make it.
Yeah, and Hans knows better. Whether he repeats or not because he has no better options, he does. I think Hans knows that Magnus is not going to take a draw. As I said a few moments ago, I think a draw would actually be a fantastic result for Hans in game 2. Doesn't go to d8, goes to b8, but similarly, the queen gets out of the way, doesn't repeat, and now she spies the f4 pawn once again, Robert.
Also keeps the white queen honest in many positions. The b2 pawn, knight h5 is in the air. That looks quite frustrating to deal with. But I think what black is struggling with is that this pawn on d5 is such a nuisance. If this rook could jump over to the king side, then that pawn runs free, and that's a very close passer. So Magnus, he's better, but he also has his hands full.
No, I could sense the tone in your slight hesitation. He's better, but it's not as big of an advantage as it was. I'm just completing Robert's sandwich there. And I think, and you see, now it's close back to equal, right? So can Hans play d6 and get away with it? That's the question.
It's a very tempting move here. Both players do not have very much time. And it seems that Magnus under 20 seconds, and Hans similarly in some time trouble himself. But the d6 pawn, is it a strength? Is it a weakness? That's the big question.
Knight to e2 is played there to defend both f4 and g3. Queen to c3 check. And, queen f2 comes in.
But f5, it's also a target.
Hans is on the attack.
And he goes knight g3, does Magnus. So look at this, the f5 pawn is protected, e2 is coming, knight f1 check is in the air. This is way too complicated.
It's a 3-result game, though. Hans could easily strike back here. Maybe Magnus bails out with a draw because he doesn't want to let him get his first dub, and indeed, that is what Magnus does. You could kind of sense it, that Magnus knew that one kind of got away from him a little bit, and he's like, I'm not going to let the young man get on the board just yet.
Well, especially what you said before, that for Hans, a draw wasn't the worst result. But considering how that game went, the draw was a great result.
I agree.
That builds confidence that he was able to hold what became a tough position. And now as we head into the third game, well, Magnus, he probably should make some moves. But it looks like Hans has the white pieces again, and maybe they need to switch that.
Yeah, something happened there. The players got the wrong color back-to-back. I'm sure that they're figuring it out, and that's probably why the game is either going to be aborted or something. But yeah, so back to what you said, from a storyline perspective, that was huge for Hans, because not only was a draw probably a good result, even if he didn't want to admit it, you don't want to lose 2 in a row, but getting a draw when you were much worse is super important, and he steals stalemate from the jaws of defeat, and he's in this match.
Yeah, he stole a half point there. I mean, it's maybe a bit too harsh to call it stealing a half point. He really was playing some great defensive moves. And we see these two players. We see the screen here with the black pieces. We have this pawn triangle in the center. So hopefully we can get these two players going swinging every single game, because, Danny, they drew that game 2. Magnus retains his 1-point lead. He must be feeling pretty good. And we see Hans on screen, but we can also see Magnus. And Magnus looks as kind of comfortable and calm as ever.
He does. He looks comfy, and the position is on the board. We can see it. I actually do really like this view, by the way. We've got the full sight of what the players are looking at, which isn't just one of the many different versions of security that we have going, but it's also good content.
Yeah, it's good to have this kind of overhead view, and we see the players actually move pieces in different ways. Some of them drag the pieces, others click one square and then the next, and we see a pre-move. Look at that. We wouldn't normally get to see that, but Hans is ready for a capture on d5.
Yeah, he pre-moved, and we know that the score needs updating, everybody. We will get that taken care of. The score is currently 1.5 to 1/2 Magnus. We will get on that, don't you worry. But okay, on the board, the aggressive h4. This is how legendary King's Indian attacks start, and it shows that Magnus, he still wants blood. He's coming after it. He changed the structure in the last game the moment he had a chance to go after Hans' kingside, And here goes another kingside attack.
Yeah, it looks like a King's Indian attack, as you were saying. And look at Black's position. We have the pawn on A5, the pawn on D5, but all these pieces are kind of stuck on the first 3 ranks. Primarily this bishop on C8, not a very good piece, at least not yet. And rook E1 play just to keep the pawn on E5 defended. Then this knight is free to hop to G5. There's going to be some danger in front of the black camp. And if you ever play H6, you have to be very careful. You're creating a hook in the position, and then eventually a G4, G5 to try to pry open the kingside.
Magnus traded on D5 and played D4. One, it keeps both knights out of C5. It keeps all 3 minor pieces out of C5. He owns that square and ensures that with a closed center, he can focus on his job, which is, I'm going to try to checkmate the black king. It's educational for everyone watching. Typically, if you're attacking on one side of the board, you want the center closed. You don't want anything dynamic distracting you from your work, like a surgeon who goes in for something important. No more center will be open. Hans is going to have to deal with a big attack from Magnus on the king side.
Yeah, B5, B4, that doesn't really have much to it. So bishop C6, just trying to get a little bit more active, and Magnus quickly jumps forward, knight to G5. Queen D3 is on the docket. That may force a pawn push to G6, and there's weak dark squares on the king side. And I think that for Hans, you made a really good point, Danny. This pawn on D4, a pawn 3 squares away from a knight dominates that knight, so that knight can't hop forward. It's a very passive piece, and a knight on the rim, it's looking quite dim.
Yeah, both knights are corralled, 1 3 squares away, 1 on the rim. I don't even see a good future for either of them right now. This is a position where you already start thinking about, how can I justify F6? Or what else do I need to do to survive the attack? Do I play rook E8 and then put the knight on F8? We see that Hans was hovering with the mouse over B5. I actually do love that view. It's fun to see what the players do because they all do it differently. Some drag, some click. Sometimes they like to hold the piece over to go full XQC PogChamp style and just check all the legal moves. I mean, I'm kidding. But Hans was holding B5 before he played it for several seconds.
And some players like to pre-move. Just in case something is captured, they pre-move it to save that little bit of time. But here it's going to be a difficult time for Hans. He's trying to go forward on the queen side. Here we already see checkmate in 1 is threatened. Hans, of course, will not blunder that, but if he does play pawn to H6, we may see a sacrifice on that square in the near future once the knight retreats. So, Danny, this is not looking very pleasant for Hans Niemann. This is all Magnus Carlsen could dream of in this game 3.
Not at all pleasant for Hans Niemann. If H6 is played, by the way, that pony will go to H3 to leave that diagonal open, and that's why Hans says, I'm not even going to go for that. I'm going to get rid of my favorite bishop, but I have no choice because I got to stop checkmate. And back to my point about knight F8. Ooh, no, now it's not possible. I was going to say, you got to consider whether you're going to leave that square open for the rook, and he didn't.
No.
So now you are really trapped on the king side. That knight is no help. Looks very scary for black.
And the main idea that you talked about, Danny, was to play F6, but that's not going to work with this E6 pawn targeted by 2 of white squares. So this is like a boa constrictor right now. Black cannot lash out, just hop forward with any of the pieces. The knight, okay, can go to C4, good for you. The pawn pushes to B3 and gets rid of your 1 threat. So I'm thinking that Magnus has a great chance here. He may consider pushing this H pawn, trying to pry open the dark squares. Only white has the dark square bishop.
He's playing with house money here. When you've got this much space and all the options, you could also go for bishop F1, bishop D3. Let's highlight that. Not something you can always do once you fee and kettle, but with a closed center, that light square bishop on C6 for black is not going to have any part. And so, okay, he gets another piece in the game. Use all your forces, kids, in chess when you're attacking. Magnus Carlsen leading by example by bringing that pony to the king side.
Don't put the cart before the horse, so here comes that horse, that pony, that knight, just trying to help in the attack.
Kingdom for a horse?
Yeah, well, sometimes you have to. This black kingdom over here is in grave danger. I just don't see easy moves for Hans. I actually think that the evaluation bar is accurate. I would never have first thought this +3. I would just look at this position and say that white is having all the fun because black's pieces, look at them, the 3 minor pieces over here doing absolutely nothing.
Yeah, the computers sometimes put math to the human evaluation. We would just look at this and say, white is dominating. Checkmate is coming to the king side. Here comes knight F4. Here comes knight H5. The F6. We might get a photo finish here, right? Get your puzzle rush out, boys and girls. The pieces on the king side are not playing. So is it +3? Is it somewhere even closer to +8 when it comes to how humans think about this? This just feels so bad right now for Hans.
And just a loose position because this queen protects the bishop. That may seem irrelevant, but if you ever want to play F6 and bring your queen over to the king side to help defend, your queen is actually doing an important job. Now, there is a threat here.
Yeah.
I see a fork. This knight will hit both rooks at the same time, so don't just play A3 thinking that little pawn is under attack and look at Magnus.
Yeah.
Take this pawn. It's not relevant here.
He might even take, I was going to say, he might even take the exchange right now. I thought he might play rook takes c6 first, but the idea is sort of the same. Knight takes g7 and bishop f6 are threats on the board, everybody. Hans has less than 15 seconds. This is a one-sided game, as dominant as any we have seen in the first three. Magnus Carlsen is bringing the pain and bringing the house over here.
I think you could just take on g7 with his knight, but you do want to calculate. You just don't want to give away your pieces when you're up 2.5 minutes. So for Magnus Carlsen, he's in a dominant position. He's leading by 1 point, about to make that 2. But look at him, knight f6 with a fork. And if you take it, bishop takes, and the king is smothered in the corner. That's just a checkmate.
Well, queen h5 is coming next. We have more checkmate threats. Rook takes c6 might just be adding insult to injury. No, he doesn't even want it. I mean, that was a free piece. He'll probably take it after bishop takes f6 check. Hans made that move with 0.7 seconds. Rook takes c6. Hans not going to resign. I think that from a match strategy point of view, are we already thinking, all right, this isn't going well? Is it the psychology you and I talk about of let me work out the nerves? Or is it like, I'm already thinking about getting seconds off the clock because I actually like my chances in faster time controls against Magnus?
Oh, I think it's quite clear that Hans's best chances are in the quicker time controls, but let's not forget that Magnus Carlsen is no slouch in bullet chess. So no matter what time control, it's going to be a problem. Magnus Carlsen wins by resignation. We have our first 2-game lead of the match.
It is a 2-game lead for Magnus Carlsen. They switch colors, and they're going to quickly do it again. And this is the script. We talk about how Hans Niemann, okay, he wasn't winning, but he was better as black. And he was this close to maybe having that other storyline people talked about. What he needed to do was to get an early lead. Now he's in that storyline that people said you don't want to get here because if the GOAT gets going, he don't stop.
And Hans is a streaky player, and sometimes that plays to his benefit where he wins a number of games in a row. But like any player, you could be victim to tilt. So he is playing a calm game 4 right now with the white pieces. That's the good news. But he may already be in results-oriented thinking. When you're playing the best player in the world and you're down by 2 points in a match that has a finite amount of time, you start thinking, I need to get those wins, but then you're not playing chess.
Yeah, you can't let any decision that has nothing to do with what's on the board affect your decisions on the board. Obviously, much easier said than done. The best players in the world do it better than all of us, but they are human, and certain players, as you said, are more shrieky than others. Certain players, like if they start off well, they're just like, what are they capable of? And so Hans doesn't want any type of streakiness to continue here because that streak is not going well right now.
Well, we've seen this position before. This would happen a couple games ago, and this exact position occurred, and Magnus did the same thing. He tried to open the d-file, trade some rooks, and it worked out quite well for him in that game. So he took on d6 with the pawn when the capture happened. Danny, I have to think that this is good for Magnus Carlsen because he's not required to go deep into the memory bank. He just played this position, and objectively, it's quite solid for black.
He changes up by taking the rook, which allows the queen to take, because now black will be the first one to get the d-file. If you're just tuning in, folks, this exact game occurred in game 2, and Hans Niemann played rook e to d1 there, or sorry, rook e to e1 there instead of rook takes d6. Here, Hans takes on d6. I don't like the repetition from Hans, because even though that game was a draw, I liked how Hans played until he played f3 in that game. So he varied. I wish Hans had played the same line he did. I thought his position was going okay. Now he goes for something different. Maybe he wants to switch to an attack on the king side.
But let's not forget, neither of these players had the opportunity to check the line. He only knows what the result of the game was and how, the direction it was going. And it was all Magnus for quite a while. So this seems quite safe. For white, the knight's on f5. That's always dangerous. Some people like to call it a knife on f5 as you're trying to slice up the black king side. But it's not in time, Dan. You need to jump over this knight, bring a rook to g3. It takes so much time to make this work. The good news for Hans, Danny, is that this queen on b3 is keeping Magnus's rook honest on the b-file.
I've been super into jumping over pieces variants. I really want it on chess.com. Just like, can we just get one move a game where you can put a piece and jump over your own piece? I'm just saying. We'll get on that. All right, he goes back to e1 because, jokes aside, he doesn't really have a chance to focus on the king side anymore, and you can overcommit to an attack if it's not there. So again, this is a mature move from Hans. I like it. He's staying in the game, staying focused. That shows like, hey, I'm not going to let emotions run this game. I'm not going to try to pretend there's an attack where there's not. He plays rook e1. He's got a time edge on the clock. I like what Hans is doing.
And if we count the small pluses, they actually are in white's favor. White has the better knights. This knight on c6 dominated by this pawn 3 squares away. This knight on f3 attacking, this knight defending. This knight on f5 very active here. It's actually quite a menacing piece. And now it steps back because it wants to jump to a new 5th rank square, like knight d5, and trying to go after this pawn on e5. So, Danny, I have to say that Magnus handling himself quite well. We're used to seeing him acquit himself like this. But for Hans, I mean, he is doing the right thing. He is trying to cause these little problems for Magnus. Just Magnus is in form right now.
Magnus is in form. Hans is in time, perhaps for the tactics to work as e5 will hang, but there's knight a5 at the end, so I was trying to calculate this. Let's see. Here comes knight a5. What does Hans see? Because d5 is going to fall.
That's a problem, and this knight can come into c4 in many positions as well. There is no queen a3 because the black queen will just trade and white's pawn structure will be ruined. So it looks like Magnus can take on d5, give up the e5 pawn, and that looks like equality.
Yeah, maybe that's all it is then. Hans went for it. Though pausing now makes you always wonder, right? Did they miss something before, or is there something misevaluated here? Because you go for a forcing line, you expect it to kind of play out there. So certainly Hans didn't miss knight a5, but I'm just curious what maybe he didn't evaluate that he didn't like, because you're headed to an endgame, and by the way, you're headed down on the clock, and Magnus wants. Oh, you looked at me. You gave me that Magnus look. Don't you look at me like that in here. That's the Magnus look where you said. Magnus says, I'm now playing for a win.
Yes, Magnus didn't just want to trade off more pieces, give up the e5 pawn for the d5 pawn. Instead, he says, that's a big target. Knight c4 is available, hitting b2, and that knight can always slide back to b6 to add another attacker. And I mentioned how black's knight was bad before. Suddenly, it's white's knight that is very bad. Unless it can jump forward, and it can't do that quickly enough, it looks like black's knight is actually going to do some damage.
Yeah, you did. You gave me the Magnus look. I don't know what that is. Like we'll give it something else, some other nickname. But I've gotten that look from you many times over the years, and that was like, hey, not so fast. We're not just talking about equality. Magnus senses when his opponents would be happy for that. Here comes, I mean, the knight could go to c4 and either b6 or d6. Even just put that knight on d6, you're happy from a blockading perspective, right? Because that d5 pawn is still weak. That b5 pawn helps hold it back. That's exactly what Magnus does. So again, objectively, the computer's right, everybody, but this is Magnus Carlsen, and that d5 pawn is definitely weaker than any pawn black has.
Although if the white queen can move back and then c4 can be played, we start to see that white will coordinate his forces. He'll protect that loose pawn on d5. So the queen on b4, I like that square. It can actually go to a5, hit this a6 pawn, which is loose in all these positions. So, Danny, I have to say both sides will have their chances.
Yeah, I agree. And right as I said, there is no pawn in black's camp that's as weak as d5. Hans says, wait, queen b4. I can go to a5 and a6 is weak. I can go to c5 and c7 is weak. So Magnus correctly pausing 10 seconds for station identification on the Magnus Carlsen Endgame Technique Network. He's been hosting that show for a very long time. So he's like, wait, I'm going to pause here. Let me make sure I choose the right plan before we get ourselves in an endgame.
You got to go.
Oh. I'm talking here. My partners need some water. We're talking a lot. All right, hey, live television, everybody. Let's make some noise up here. We got Magnus Carlsen, Hans Niemann. Let's go. All right, Queen h5 is played. Queen h5 is played. Okay, Magnus is going to get aggressive. That's funny that you run away from what the white queen is trying to do to go to c5 or a6. And, yeah, Queen f5 is played. Will we get knight e4 or pawn to e4? That is an interesting question.
It's a tough question.
It's a tough question.
I'm tough to answer because I don't have a voice. But here, the voice comes back. The queen on f5, it does look powerful. And knight e4, as you mentioned, one idea. Pawn e4, another. Because that pawn on d5, Danny, is a pawn that's extended quite far. And that's what we don't like to see. We typically think of advanced pawns going to the other side, becoming a queen. But here it's actually overextended, and black can try to focus his forces on it.
Yeah. Well, here we go. Now we're going to focus a little bit on the players. And, okay, the d5 pawn is the biggest target. Hans Niemann still has a teeny time advantage, but that's about to go away. Will there be e4? Will there be pawn? Will the knight come to e4? We don't know. So Hans has to calculate all of these tactics. Queen f5 is threatening queen to b1 check as well. Let's make sure we don't lose sight of that. And Hans nervous here, bouncing a little bit, wants to make sure he chooses the right line. He plays a4. That's an aggressive approach over there. A weakening one potentially to the queenside pawn structure.
a4. So queen b1, followed pawn takes a4, and we see the first step in that direction. But at pawn a4, queen takes a4. That's key, because the queen trade, I was about to say, favors black, and he finds a new way of doing it, bringing the queen into e4. Danny, this looks like trouble for Hans.
Yeah, if the queens come off, every pawn is on the agenda for black. If that knight comes to e4, d5 is weak, c3 is weak. At this point, even b3 and a4 might potentially have bleak futures, depending on what happens over there with the tension. So, and that knight on f3 is kind of dominated, not just by the pawn on e5, holding the d4 square, but the pawn on f6. So, okay, Hans has a big decision to make. He's using his time, which now means he's down on time and under a minute.
This is not the position you want, and especially against this opponent. This is Magnus Carlsen, the best endgame player you could possibly ask for. So you see Hans, he's trying to figure this out. Can he trade queens? The answer is no. He drops the pawn immediately. And if I can't trade queens because that looks bad, do I bring my queen up to a5? And it is on the rim, but it is putting pressure on c7 and a6. So at least that looks more appealing, except queen f4 check and pawn e4. The rook on d2 is loose.
Well, I'm glad you highlighted that, because okay, he played queen c5. I'm saying that's a blunder that's coming. Queen f4 check and e4. You highlighted that that's a blunder to watch out for. Hans plays queen to c5. And what happens on e4? Queen takes c7? Rook to c8? The knight is guarded by the queen, though. So I'm thinking black is winning material here.
e4 looks excellent. Knight e4, by the way, would be appealing in other positions, but this is what Magnus wanted. Queen c1, there is knight g1, so that's why the king went into the corner. It didn't slide to g1, but Magnus plays knight f5, just going after this rook. If rook b4, there's pawn a5. Get out of here. Get off the 4th rank. Stop pinning this e4 pawn, says Magnus. He wants to win this knight.
Yeah, knight f5, well-timed, hits the rook. That rook is overworked. You want to keep pinning the pawn on e4, but if you leave the d-file, stranger things will happen. Okay, Hans finds a kind of a chaos move here, right? Guerrilla warfare, throw a grenade in and jump out and see what happens here, but Magnus doesn't normally fall for that type of stuff. He'll figure out the tactics.
But it's a smart move to try to get in the trenches, because if you do take on d6 with the pawn, this queen slides over to d5 with check and then picks up this e4 pawn as that black king is in the line of sight. So rook takes d6 played, and it was a mistake, but looking at the clocks, I think that's the biggest hurdle for Hans right now.
Yeah. Rook takes d6, and now c takes d6. Hans down on the time there. We're gonna address the visual there. We're having trouble seeing the white clock as every time it's ticking. That's actually just a font issue. So there's, just so you know, there's no issue right there with the players not seeing the time of game. That is something only we can all see as fans watching this. So everybody take a breath. The players are not seeing that. That is just a color issue with the time disappearing. We'll get it fixed. Okay, knight to d4 played.
Just trying to trade off the pieces.
Trying to trade off pieces.
The black king, it's not the safest square for it. You would hope that there are more pawns safeguarding it, but with some weak light squares, there could be some checks against it, and if you can't parry them off, that will give white drawing chances. But that's why Magnus, he presses forward, pawn to f5. Hans really is barely getting his moves off. 0.4 seconds when he made that last move, and the white queen is in, but unfortunately for Hans, that the black queen is centralized. I mean, look at this, Danny. E3 happens, C3 will be loose, and maybe queen f4, queen f2.
Oh, it's happening. It's happening. The queen comes in, the e-pawn will run. There is no perpetual. Ooh, Magnus wants more. He's going to take pawns with check and make sure that he works it with no diggity here. He might even get the queens off the board before he advances e2. No, now queen f5 check was easier, but 2 queens will get the job done. Magnus Carlsen has a 3-game lead.
Unbelievable start for Magnus Carlsen. Look at him. He's determined. I was going to say the gloves are off, but the headsets are off, because then it's midway through, they get a break.
The gloves are off. Hans Niemann is off. Heads back to the players' lounge. He's going to take a breath, make sure that that this thing stays close. He doesn't want Magnus Carlsen getting any more of his mojo going than he already has working. When he came out, he had a big smile on his face. The fans cheered for him. He's going to have a big smile on his face. To a break here in just a moment. Magnus Carlsen has a 3-game lead. The second semifinal of the 2024 Speedchess Championship continues when we return.
Hans Niemann had unquestionably the toughest and most dramatic road to the Speedchess Championship Finals. On May 20th, he won his first ever title Tuesday, and he soon recorded more strong results, earning enough points on the Title Cup leaderboard to take the last qualification spot in a nerve-wracking final day. Niemann's first match was against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, a former Speedchess Championship finalist. Vachier-Lagrave started with a lead in the 5+1 time control, but Niemann bounced back in 3+1. The score was all tied up in the final bullet game when pure chaos ensued. Beating Vachier-Lagrave was a tremendous feat, but the French former world blitz champion has been known to be streaky. How would Niemann fare against another Speedchess finalist and one of the most solid blitz chess players ever, Wesley So? Even better, it turned out. Nearly everything went Niemann's way against So, as he defended tenaciously in the hardest spot, and even won from dead loss positions. Niemann himself could not help but laugh. In the post-match interview, Niemann reasserted that these fantastic results show him to be one of the best players in the world, and he called out Chess.com and Magnus Carlsen.
I'm not a victim, so I don't need an apology. My vengeance will be victory on the chessboard.
This will be the first time Niemann has faced Magnus Carlsen in person since the cheating scandal 2 years ago, and the world will surely be watching.
Hikaru is just like, the thing is with Hikaru is that, I don't know, he's 35? Or
he's 36.
36, yeah. The thing with Hikaru is that I don't have to beat him today, but he's 36. Like, there's gonna be a time when Hikaru's sitting in his pineapple shirt and he's not playing chess anymore, and he's just gonna have to watch me win tournament after tournament. He's gonna be too old to even compete.
By then I'll have 10 million subs.
So I prefer not even to beat him. I just would like him to not even have the chance to compete against him. Like, I want him, like, my reign is gonna last so long that he's gonna be at the age of like, just like he can't even walk anymore, and I'm still gonna be winning. So that is how I imagine.
You're gonna be like 70 and he's still winning?
I intend on sort of keeping the power. So, okay, I can beat him while he's playing, but I think the best part would be like when he's just done, and then he has to watch me. Sort of like that's the ultimate victory.
It's like how people feel in tennis now with Nadal. And do you have an inspiration? I know you talk a lot about.
I like Djokovic. I like Djokovic.
Oh, but
Fischer is my main. Fischer is my main inspiration. He's my sort of greatest idol, and the way that he sort of overcame the Soviet Union, and it was something that a level of greatness that can never be compared.
Do you think it's more impressive to overcome chess.com or the Soviet Union?
I think the KGB is a bit more like they're a bit dirtier. Okay, it's close, but like, you know.
It's close.
Welcome to Lifetime Repertoire's Jobava London. I want to bring the Jobava London back to life, not only at the top level, but to popularize it throughout all levels of chess, because I truly believe in the power of the opening. It's not just aggressive, it's not just positional. The fact that it's dynamic means that you're going to be forced to play different types of positions, developing positional, aggressive, attacking skills all at the same time.
You hear the fans, they're in here. They're here for it. They're loud. And Magnus Carlsen, well, his chess has been loud on the board. Hans Niemann comes back, and he'd like the chess to speak for itself in the next few games of the 5-minute portion.
And you can see the look on his face. He's disappointed with how the match has gone thus far, and he's had some chances in these games. Like game one in particular, he got off to a good start. He was able to kind of outplay Magnus from the opening stage, but the last bunch of games, Danny, they have not gone his way. Magnus Carlsen in a 3-point lead at this stage of the match, and we know that Magnus doesn't get weaker as the time controls get shorter.
He doesn't. What he does in bullet, I mean, people think of Hikaru, they think of Alireza Firouzja. If you saw the stats at the start of the match, Magnus Carlsen is the best player in SCC history in every time control that we've ever had, at least from a record perspective. And there are different ways we break that down in terms of accuracy and quality of moves and those things. But Magnus Carlsen wins more games than anyone in every time control. So Hans Niemann needs to strike back, and he needs to strike back now. And we're going to see if he can do it.
Well, there is plenty of time left on the overall match clock. So for Hans, he can take it one game at a time, but the problem is he's facing Magnus Carlsen. I don't know how many times I'm going to have to say that, but Magnus just doesn't lose by himself. It's very rare that he collapses, and as we see that we have an English type of position of Fianchetto from the white side, this overhead view, I'm a big fan.
I agree. I love it. It's fun to see what the players see. It's also fun to see their theme, right? Everyone knows what the streamers have when they play. You've got your favorite purple Botez board, and you've got the ICC Hikaru Nakamura setup. There you go. You got a classic OTB look there from Hans Niemann. But all right, and we've got a fun little live board over there with the chessboard theme that more chess games have been played on than any theme in history. If you didn't know, that is our standard neo-green chess set.
Is that because people actually like it, or they're too lazy to change it from the default setting?
It's definitely the latter. It's definitely the lazy. I mean, people aren't going to change their chessboard. It's easy. Plus, it's a fantastic-looking chess set. Shout out to Dallin. I love that chess set. I love that king.
It does look good. I'm pretty sure that's the setup I use on my end. So, I get it. It looks good. And right now, Magnus Carlsen's chances look very good. And look at him changing his music.
There you go. Hans switching it up, hitting a new playlist, right? Hit a new rhythm. Let's go, Hans. Let's figure it out. Find a way to put a crack in the armor of Magnus Carlsen and get your first victory in this Speed Chess Championship semifinal.
That would be huge. And we see that there's a white queen sitting in the center. The black queen is at home. And typically you don't want to lead with your queen because you get kicked around by less valuable pieces. But for now, the balance of the position is one where there is not a symmetrical pawn structure. Both players have different tasks. And we also see a knight on the rim, Danny. We've seen that a few times in the early going here.
Yeah, the knight on a6 is on the rim, but it's also kind of typical of this structure. It has options, right? Sometimes it goes back to c7. You see that square available if the knight was to retreat to support the pawn to advance in the center. Sometimes it does find a more aggressive home. Note that it's Magnus, again, thinking a little more at this stage right now and trying to use this critical moment to make sure he gets off to yet another good start, because he sure is off to a good start in the match.
Yes, he is, and you do not want to let your opponent back in. We've seen it in so many Speed Chess Championship matches over the years. When you get out to an early lead, like, say, Jan Nepomniachtchi against Hikaru Nakamura, you're up by 3 points. Things are seemingly awesome for you. You don't have any worries, and then your opponent storms back. So for Magnus Carlsen, I think that he kind of wants to win every single game they play.
Magnus Carlsen wants to win every chess game he plays. There's a memo. There's a memo for you. Sorry, I was just teasing you a little bit, Captain Obvious over here. No, Magnus Carlsen does like to win every chess game he's ever played. You know what else Magnus does? He tends to play really good chess moves really fast.
He does do that, Captain Obvious, so thank you for joining me. Actually, you're more of Captain Underpants, but that's a different story. But what is a story of this particular game is that Magnus voluntarily doubled his own pawns. He could have captured back with the queen, but there are all sorts of knight forks in the air. So instead, we see this compromised pawn structure, but the bad news about double pawns is that it becomes harder to create a password later. They can't protect one another. But the good news is the open file. So there is an open B file for one rook, an open D file for the other. But right now, Magnus has to figure out what to do with his bishop on g5. Does he capture this knight, Danny?
I love what you highlighted there. Plus, double pawns are weaker when they can be attacked. It's hard to attack those pawns right now, right? They're not on an open file themselves, so there's no rook coming to c8 for black. There are no pieces immediately coming after the c-pawns, and they kind of control the game right now. They control all the squares. They keep that knight on the rim, looking grim. So, yeah, these are those double pawns. It's one of those moves you see, and at first you go, ooh, classical chess principles, and then you go, oh, modern chess understanding. Double pawns for the win.
And, well, we have double isolated pawns for both sides. So this is not a recommended pawn structure for either player. So for those of you watching, both at home and in the live audience, try not to do this yourself, because these pawns are hard to defend, particularly the lead pawn, because it's closer to enemy territory, which means it's more approachable by enemy pieces. So, for example, black would love to get these two moves in and go after c4, but as we mentioned, there's an open file on the b line. That keeps the bishop tied down to b7. Rook coming to d1 would make a move like pawn d6. Well, now impossible. You can do it, but you just lose the pawn on the spot.
But Mangus gives up the pawn on e2 for compensation. The problem really with Hans' position are those queenside pieces that are not playing, right? your old school abusive chess coach would come over and just take them off the board and say, if you're not going to use them, I'm taking them, right? You say, that's toxic behavior. Don't treat me like that. But that's a different story. The point is, you got to get those pieces developed. They're not playing on A8 and C8, and that is a problem for Hans Niemann.
Well, he didn't take the pawn. He said brought his knight to c5. That knight wants to get into f5, hit the h6 pawn and that d6 square, and his bishop is buried right now. So d6, it opens up that line, stops the knight from getting to f5, but as we see Magnus quickly retreat his knight, it's to open up the d file. But Danny, you mentioned it, the e2 pawn is still vulnerable. This is actually quite a dynamic position.
Yeah, and this is a big position too, I think. You have to calculate a lot. Do you go for forcing variations here? Take e2, you trade for d6. Who gets the better of that at the end? The rooks are getting active. The files are opening up. Do you deal with b3 first? Exactly, you're highlighting all of it. Ultimately, if you take on b3 as black, you open that rook on a1, and then a7 is a potential problem down the a file. So yeah, we get to highlight and have fun up here with everyone else. But these are the variations that Hans is going to be calculating here, which is why he's taken a moment to think, flexing that time advantage.
Important that he keeps that lead on the clock, because we've seen when he gets under the duress of time trouble, he is going to struggle against Magnus. And in this endgame, we see that black's pawns look worse on the surface, but I do like this rook on e2. It's super active here. It could slide behind either the c3 or the b3 pawns over here, but you do need to watch out because rook d8 check next. If white got a free turn, that actually wins material. With bishop h3 to follow, you got pile up pressure on pin pieces.
Yeah, and so Hans says, I'm not going to have any of that. I will develop. Hans plays bishop e6. Magnus immediately responds with b4. He's saying, I don't care about that c4 pawn. What's the compensation here? He wants rook d7, I guess, and it's that simple and subtle, but sometimes Magnus makes chess look easy.
He does. He's just trying to gain control of a key square. Also, the f6 pawn is hanging behind the bishop, so he could go in that direction as well. Bishop takes c4. Bishop f1 is tempting. It won't work out, so that's why we see rook e8 give up a7. Danny, I mean, different pawns are hanging. It's hard to actually know what's what here, but there is some trouble for the white king, and that's why that rook stays parked on the first rank.
Yeah, you have to be careful. This is probably objectively should be a draw, and probably all the queenside pawns should come off for each other. And if that happens, maybe Magnus is happy, because at least then black's pawn structure is slightly weaker, right? Those doubled F pawns and weak H6 pawn, but isn't enough to win. That would be the question. But here we go. Magnus plays rook takes A7. We're going to get forcing lines. Does Hans have rook C1? That could get scary for Magnus. Yeah, here comes the checkmate.
I see what you want over there. And actually, we should pull up an analysis board because it's a very tricky line. If you think it's just about a pin on the first rank, it's not just that. Rook takes F1, king takes F1 to make that quick move. Bishop H3 check, the king moves out the way, and then rook E1 would be a checkmate. So be very careful about these sequences. But the key for white is that if rook takes F1, I think there's rook takes E6. You're trying to checkmate me on the light squares. I'm going to remove your greatest attacker, and you see that the engine favors white because the end game is nice. The B7 pawn will fall after both those rooks come off the board.
Move, king, get out the way, checkmate for Hans. He would love that. Hoping to get his first win here. I'm gonna be honest or be a little personally biased. I'm hoping for Hans to get his first win. I want to see it. I want to see Hans strike here and get a dub. But I don't think Magnus blunders into those types of tactics. And now Hans is getting under 30 seconds, which makes you even more nervous because very few enter these types of situations against Magnus Carlsen and come out alive to talk about it.
Yeah, he probably is looking at the c3 pawn, which can be captured, but then white plays c5, and suddenly there's a clamp down the queen side. That b7 pawn cemented in place. It's a target. Look at the clock. Hans suddenly in huge time trouble.
Yeah, and ultimately plays a move you don't want to see with bishop c8. It's a passive move. Magnus could come back to d1 and take care of problems, but then c3 falls. Again, objectively, we're looking at a very equal position. I guess, you know, the evaluation bar, the opinion of the computer reveals as much. But you know that Magnus is going to do the thing he does to just pose problems.
Oh, wait. No, now it works.
Now it works.
Yes, because there is no rook sacrifice on e6, and Hans is having a problem here. I'm not sure what, but something has gone wrong.
I have no idea what's going on. He plays rook c1, king to g2. He takes f1, and he's just winning.
Yes.
Magnus shakes his head. He's just blundered.
He did, and that's what bishop c8 was so brilliant, because he gets out the way from a counter sacrifice. That rook needed to take the bishop in the other variation, and now we see a position where white actually has 3 pawns for a bishop. That seems to be an equivalent point value, but it's not just about the materials with king safety. It's about how players can proceed from here, and it's those light squares that are a devastating problem for white.
Devastating problems on the clock. If Hans doesn't focus, he's complaining about something. The arbiter is watching. We also have a camera on the board. We can confirm in real time everything the players see and how it aligns exactly with the server. So if Hans Niemann is trying to play the Vladimir Kramnik gambit here, it's not going to work. There are no situations where the clock is not under thorough review. I'm not sure what he was complaining about there, but it looked like he was saying that my clock was jumping.
Well, they're definitely going to review it afterwards. We have cameras behind the players, as we've seen. So if there is something that needs to be reviewed, of course it will be reviewed. I mean, that's just fair play for all. And in this position, I mean, we still do have 3 pawns extra for white, an extra bishop for black. That material dynamic, it's important, but even more important, the utmost importance is king safety, and that white king is in huge trouble.
Yeah, and the bishop comes to e6. The white king is in huge trouble. Hans Niemann should get his first win here. He's close, but Magnus Carlsen is not going to lie down. Here come the double rooks, though. And Hans, by the way, finds this with just a couple seconds, which is brilliant chess. Will he get enough here? Doesn't want to settle on the draw. Okay, he couldn't take c4. Yes, because a rook takes c4.
But he's just going after the white king. You could take b7, but then you get checkmated on the first rank. One of these rooks is going to do the damage. So you see a resignation, and that's